We're going to be talking about XML, kind of giving you an overview so you understand what it is. And then we will get into using Ajax to update portions of your page with XML data. So first of all, XML is similar to HTML in that there are opening and closing tags. It's typically used for data storage. It is not a replacement for HTML. It actually complements HTML. Okay? And as I mentioned, it's used for data storage. What I like about XML is that you make up your own tags. So the tags can be whatever you want. There are typically opening and closing tags. And so I have a little example here. This would be like a little memo. So you have an opening note and a closing note. You have two from, a heading, and a body. Okay, and these are all made up. So in XML, there are no pre-existing tags. All the tags that are there are ones that you make up. And typically XML is used to store data. You can retrieve the data and process the data using Ajax calls and JavaScript or jQuery, and you can actually update XML files as well. All XML files are plain text files, so they are compatible with all the different types of software and hardware, so you don't need to worry about incompatibility. You do need to be a little familiar with structure, because even though you are making up the tags, there is a tree structure in XML. And so typically you have kind of an opening tag, which is kind of the top of the tree or the root. Okay? And then at the very bottom, you have the corresponding closing tag. And then if you look at each little section here, you'll notice that the same tags are used over and over. So we have an opening book and a closing book. Opening book, closing book. And these are all made up. So within the book tag, we have title, author, year, and price. And you'll notice within the next book tag, we have title, author, year, and price. Within the next book tag, we have title, author, year, and price, and so on. So there's even though you're making up the tags, there is a definite structure to the tags. Okay, and indenting the tags kind of gives you an idea about the relationship, as we have the root tag, and then one level down would be a child. Okay, and a level down from that would be like a grandchild. And if you're looking at title, author, year, and price, okay, they're children of book. So book is their parent. Book's parent is bookstore. Okay, so they have these relationships among the tags, and it's easier to see if you indent. As far as the syntax rules go, you do want to create what's called a well-formed XML document. And so at the top, the very first line in your code should be angle bracket question XML version equals 1.0 encoding equals UTF-8, and then you'll notice there's a question mark and an angle bracket. So we kind of have the opening angle bracket question mark, and then we have a closing question mark angle bracket. And then in between, it's just telling you the XML version, and it's telling you that you're using UTF-8 encoding. Okay. All elements have to have opening and closing tags, which we already mentioned. We haven't mentioned that the tags are case sensitive. Okay, so what I would recommend is making them always lowercase, and then you aren't going to have to worry about, oh, did I capitalize this or didn't I? All elements have to be properly nested, or they should be, if you want a well-formed document. If you have multiple tags around text, you have to follow kind of last in, first out, which is the same rules that apply to HTML. So if you have tag 1 and tag 2 applied to a portion of text, you back out with tag 2 followed by tag 1. This is exactly how we do it in HTML. The root element is required. Okay, so in our example up here, bookstore is the root. And you can only have one. Okay, the child of root, you'll notice book, we repeat over and over. Bookstore, the root, we don't repeat. You can have attributes added to XML tags just like you do your HTML. Do most people add attributes to XML tags? Okay, and this would be an example. So we have a note tag, and date is kind of added inside note, so it's an attribute. Quite often people do not add attributes. What they would prefer to do is create another opening and closing tag. But if you want to use attributes, you can, because this is a language that you are making up. XML does have some reserved words and special characters that you cannot use because it's going to get confused. The angle brackets, which would be less than and greater than symbols, those are reserved. So if you did want to use them, you have to actually use the HTML equivalent, which is ampersand LT semicolon for less than, ampersand GT semicolon for greater than. And then I did include a little table here so you can see some pretty common conversions. If you want a comment in your XML, you use the HTML format for comments. Spaces that you put in XML are preserved, they are not ignored. So this is different than HTML. HTML ignores extra spaces, but XML does not. Some terminology. So in XML, an element is everything from the starting tag to the ending tag. So an element can contain other elements, it can contain text, it can contain attributes, or a mixture of elements, text, and attributes. Elements can be empty, or they can contain content. If the element has content, you must have an opening and closing tag. If the element is empty, then you can do this little shortened version where you basically have one tag that has a slash before the closing angle bracket. Now you might be thinking, why in the world would it be empty? Well, XML follows a very specific structure. And it could be that the book doesn't have an author. Or maybe we don't know what the year is. So you may have an instance where something is empty. Could you put the opening and closing with nothing in it? Of course. Okay, but you could also use the shortened version. As far as the naming rules go, you can use letters, numbers, other characters. You cannot start with a number or punctuation character. You cannot start with the letters XML, okay, in any form, and the names can't have spaces. So instead of doing spaces, you might want to use camel case if you have multiple words, and that would involve everything in the first word lowercase, and then you just capitalize the first letter of the second word. Okay, so like first name. First would be all lowercase, then capital N, followed by the rest of the word name. Best practices for naming elements. It is best to use names that are descriptive. Short names are good, especially since quite often you're using code to access the XML file. And you're more likely to have typos and problems if you start using very long descriptive names. You should avoid using a dash between names because some software may think that you are trying to subtract. Also, you probably don't want to put a dot between multiple words, okay, in a name, because it's probably going to interpret that as an object and a property. Colons cannot be used in names because they are reserved for namespaces. And you can use non-English letters, but you may have problems if your software does not support them. But XML does allow them. Okay, and I mentioned how to name multi-word variables, and I mentioned camel case. So that what I would do is this third option, where I do everything in the first word lowercase and I just capitalize the first letter of the second word. But any of these are acceptable. Do everything in lowercase, do mixed casing, or camel casing. And I should mention that if the XML document is interfacing with an online database, then you're probably going to use names that correspond to what is in the actual database table that you are accessing. And I talked briefly about attributes earlier. So in HTML, if we were looking at, let's see, an anchor, href is an attribute. If you're looking at an image tag, source is an attribute. Width is an attribute. Height is an attribute. And you can add attributes that you make up. You can add them to your XML elements. Most people choose not to do that. Most people would actually create a new element instead of add the data as an attribute. So here's a little example where I've got a pet element and the attribute here is breed, and I've set breed to poodle. Then here's the same example where I have a pet element and then I have a separate element called breed. Okay, just two different ways of doing it. Why would you use it as an attribute? If you have some constraints because you are interfacing with a database, or maybe you're working on a project and everybody's using the same structure and you wanted to store some additional data, that may be a good reason for using an attribute. And I've just got some more examples here that you can take a look at. In XML, we do use a namespace because if you are making up names and you're working on a large project, quite possible that more than one person in the project is creating XML code, and if so, you may have the same names. And then you're going to end up with some naming conflicts. So what you can do is make up a namespace. Okay, the namespace is not actually real. It's made up. So you make up a namespace, and then your made up XML lives in the made up namespace, which I actually think is pretty cool. So in this little example, to define a namespace, you have to say XML NS. So that's XML namespace equals, and then give it a URL. So here I've got my little note, and you can see I've got XML namespace equals my domain / dates. My domain exists, but dates does not. Okay, totally made up. And so I basically made up a namespace, and all of these elements kind of live within this little virtual space. Okay, so that's all you have to do to avoid naming conflicts. Errors occur in XML. Basically, if you forget the opening tag, okay, tend to get errors if you forget that. Also, if you kind of mess up the opening and closing tags or the structure, you may get an error as well. To view the XML file after you transfer it to the web, some of the browsers will let you view the structure and others will not. So it just depends on which browser you are using. Chrome does tend to display the entire structure, and Safari tries to display not the XML, but the data. Okay, and I'm not sure if Safari still does that because Safari no longer runs on Windows, so can't test it. But that is what it used to do. Now, you might wonder, why in the world does XML display that way? The reason is it's data storage. We aren't telling it how to display the data. Okay, we're basically just saying, yep, this is what we're storing. So there are some additional languages that you can learn that will allow you to make the XML look pretty or display nicely. So one of those languages is Xslt, which is basically a style sheet language for your XML. Okay, and we're not going to cover that in this class, but Xslt, it basically transforms the XML, makes it look nice. XPath is used for navigating, because we've got all of the XML in these structures and we have to navigate and retrieve things. And then XSLFO, also called XSL, basically formats the XML documents. So if you want to learn more about this, I do have some links to these. What we are focusing on is XML for storage. That's how we are using XML in this class. Some of you may have heard of XQuery, and basically it's a query language kind of similar to SQL that lets you query XML data. And I have a link to that as well in case you are curious. And now that you know a little something about XML, we are going to talk about how to use Ajax to access XML and dynamically update pages. And that will be in the next video.